You're on.
Good morning. Everyone, I'm Christy Spence, and I just wanted to welcome all of you to our annual breakfast and briefing. I'm just going to say a few things, and then I'll introduce our speaker. But first, thank you all for making time to come. This is something that we look forward to every year. We get to see a lot of familiar faces and friends in the audience, and we've been doing this for over 20 years, and so it's really become a tradition of the Dairy Council, and we're thrilled to bring in speakers every year to provide information and also help build skills. And I'll introduce our speaker, Vance, in just a minute. Just a couple items to note. I want to say thank you to the farmers that we have in the room. We have several dairy farmers who've been able to make it today. If you guys would just give a little wave. It's always great to have them here and be able to connect with you, and that's who we work for. So thank you for making time to be here. A quick note, parking will be covered for you today, so if you parked in the garage downstairs, you grabbed a ticket, there are validation coupons that'll be out on the registration table. If you didn't grab one, make sure you get one of those on your way out. Also, name tags. If you didn't take your name tag, would you please grab it on your way out? It's just our little check of who RSVP'd for this event and who was actually able to make it so that we can keep track. So that would be really helpful. Also, continuing education credits. We have credits for 4 different groups, and the certificates will be on the back table. If for some reason you forget to pick one of those up, email me or Becky Lowe, and we can get you an electronic version, but those are available for you. And lastly, there are evaluations on your table. Your evaluations are hugely helpful as we plan these events in the future, and also just, give feedback to our speakers, and just so that we know if we're hitting the mark and making sure that we're meeting your needs in this area. So if you don't mind, they're anonymous, just take some time to fill that out at the end, and you can just leave them on your tables. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about just Dairy Council and some of the things that we're doing right now. In communications and as a dietitian, I feel like my most important job and what I get most excited about is really making that connection between agriculture and then the dairy products that we see in our diets and on our plates. When I first started in dietetics, I had zero ag education. I grew up in Los Angeles, and we didn't get any ag education in school. And I remember doing a lot of one-on-one nutritional counseling at the very beginning of my career, and people were asking me, they liked their meal plan, and they were like, great, Christy, this is how many carbohydrates I should be eating for sport or to lose weight. But a lot of people were asking me about where their food was coming from. They wanted to know if it was sustainable. They wanted to know how it was raised and how the farmers treated their animals. And I realized that as a dietitian, I was not equipped to answer those questions, and I didn't really even know where to direct them. And so this is 10 years ago. Fast forward to today, and we have a lot more resources. There's a lot more information out there, whether it's online or resources that you have. But one of the things that we've really tried to do over the last several years is help health professionals bridge that gap between what's going on in the agriculture world and what's going on in the world that you live in every day, where people really do want to know, of course, about nutrition and have that solid nutrition education, but they want to know beyond that what happened at the beginning. They want to understand that whole supply chain, and they want to know from the farm to the table exactly how food gets to them, what sustainability means in agriculture, and just have the information that they need. So, working directly for dairy farmers, we have this awesome opportunity to bring you back to the farm as much as possible. And so many of you have been on farm tours with me. We've done for the last 4 years. We have a really pretty robust thought leader farm tour program. We take university students from every university across the state out to dairy farms. And it's one thing to hear me talk about, my experience and what I've learned in agriculture, but to be able to go to a farm, to meet a farmer, to see how the animals are cared for, how they're raised, and how the milk gets to market is really, really valuable. So if you haven't been on a farm tour, if that's something that you're interested in doing, please let me know, and that's something that we can set up. We often do, smaller group tours. We have kind of our established tours with the university classes, but we can absolutely arrange tours. Our goal in doing this is if we can help provide some insight and some of this experiential education to the rising group of people who are going to be the next health professionals, the next educators, we can provide them with that ag knowledge that they can fall back on and feel confident and comfortable talking to their clients and patients about answering those questions about sustainability and agriculture. And even if they don't have the answers, they know where to go to get them. I think it's extremely valuable to be able to go right to the source and understand from farmers what's going on. So with that, we're expanding this tour program. We realize that one of the best groups that we have to reach is young students and kids that are in elementary school, secondary school, junior high. But we also realize that it's somewhat impractical to bus all of those kids to farms. And so we've come up with, using technology called Zoom, we've come up with this awesome way to bring the farm into the classroom, and we've piloted it over the last year. It's been hugely successful. We call it our Farm to School program. Becky and I have worked in tandem on this, and I'm gonna ask Becky to come up and just say a couple words about what the program is, what we hope to accomplish with it, and how you might be able to get involved.
I'll just stand down here. The Farm to School, I just love this part. I have worked with the school since I've started working with the Dairy Council almost 20 years ago. And we have had different programs that we've taken into the schools. And it's all about eating healthy, getting a variety of foods in your diet. And as we have moved into the Farm to School component, the more that kids understand where their food comes from, the more likely they are to eat a variety of foods, and the more likely they are to have all 5 food groups within those. And so we started with this about a year ago, taking the Farm to School into the classrooms in a little bit different way. And so on your tables, you all have an ear tag, a cow ear tag. You can use those as earrings if you want, but you can use it as a backpack or as a keychain. Okay, so what we do is we actually worked with Michelle Meineke. She's back in there somewhere. From the University of Utah. We teamed up with her, and she created a Prezi, a PowerPoint on steroids, and then we take this into the schools, but the biggest part is that we zoom in with the farmers. It is impossible for us to take 1,000 schools out to the farms. We have 700 elementary schools, and most of those are right here along the Wasatch Front. And so the more distant we become from the farm, the less likely to understand where our food comes from, as Christy was talking about, and the more likely we are to focus just on one group or 2 food groups, and we're not getting that whole variety. Okay, so the way this works, and then I'll tell you why we're even bringing it up in here, it is school-based, and we have a bunch of teachers in here. Yay, teachers. But we start off with the Prezi, and then we invite the farmer in by Zoom, which is like a FaceTime or a Skype. And the farmer gives them a tour of their, and I don't have my phone right here, here's one. So the farmer actually connects with the classroom by a phone. If they have a smartphone and internet access, then they're connected. And the farmer is able to show, what's going on in their dairy. He can change it around. We have one farmer that likes to get in his truck, and he'll drive to the next place. So he was, bouncing around, and the kids were watching this, and he was talking as he drove. It was only maybe 500 yards, to the next place, from the calves to the barn, but the kids love it. And the best part is that the kids are able to ask live questions of that farmer. The comments that come back from the students is that they love talking with a real farmer. They love seeing where their food came from. They didn't know the components of why they even need to have the dairy in their diets, to how they feed calves, to 600 calves. The kids love the calves. And so it is just phenomenal, the feedback that we're getting from this. And we're talking about nutrition. So this keychain, this cow ear tag, all cows have an ear ring, and that number is unique to them. Well, this is a unique number for the schools. So on the back side of it, we talk about there are 5 food groups. That's number 5. They need to have 3 servings of dairy a day, and they need to play for 60 minutes a day. And so here's our message, our take-home message for them, which is a fun thing. We also relate that back to the cows and their variety of diet and the care that the farmer gives to them. And so in this 45 minutes, it's just phenomenal. I love it. I really have enjoyed this part and seeing that connection. So it's nutrition, but it's looking at, how's that practical food getting into their cafeterias and their homes and their parents with it. Now, why are we even bringing this up in here? One, we do have teachers. Two, you have touch points with many schools and with many friends who are teachers or classrooms, and so share this message out. Have them contact us. We're happy to book them a presentation. It takes about 45 minutes, and the kids are they're enthralled with it. I've been in the classrooms, where they're just jumping all over the place and they want to see things. But when that farmer comes on, it's like, whoa. The noise level comes down. And then the noise level goes up when they all want to ask a question of the farmer. So it's a fun thing. But it's connecting the kids back to where their food comes from. If you have questions, I'll be in the back. If you have schools, let us know, either myself or Christy, and we'll get those booked. Thanks.
So this Farm to School program is truly a collaborative experience, and one of the things that's so great about it is that it's truly authentic. Becky talked about, one of our farmers hopping in his truck and driving down the road. It gives students, they're not actually on the farm, but it gives them this incredible touch point with a farmer in a very authentic, meaningful, live way, and they have really fun with the Q&A session. So wanted you to know that that's something that we're doing, and just encourage you to get in touch with us if that's something that you're interested in bringing to your local community. So with that, I want to introduce our speaker today. I asked Vance Crowe if he would come speak. I heard him speak last year. And as a dietitian, I think or health professional in general, we've all been in these situations where we're in a room of people, or whether it's family or friends, and the person that we're talking to is an expert in nutrition, even though they have zero nutrition knowledge. And in many cases, I just don't even say that I'm a dietitian, and I just am quiet. And that's probably not the best course of action to take. If I have information that I can share, it's healthier to, engage in a discourse and at least get people to understand a difference of opinion or a different point of view. But I think sometimes it's easier to take that path of least resistance. And so one of the things that Vance is going to talk today about is how do we communicate effectively on a subject that we are actually experts on when the other person in the room is not an expert, but they think they are. So with that, Vance Crowe is the director of Millennial Engagement at Monsanto, and he has had just a really interesting career path. He's been in the Peace Corps, he was stationed in Kenya. He has had communications experience with NPR, a station in Northern California, and he's also worked for the World Bank. He got his undergraduate degree from Marquette University and then did his graduate work in cross-cultural communications at Seton Hall University. So I'm thrilled to have him here. He's a fun, engaging speaker, and hopefully you'll leave today with some skills and feel empowered to have tough conversations and to really assert yourself with the knowledge that you absolutely have and know that you're an expert in the field. So with that, Vance, please come up. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've been with Monsanto for about 3.5 years, and I've spoken before maybe 40 or 50,000 people. And of all the times I've ever spoken, that was literally the best introduction I've ever received. I've never known anybody to know my biography just off the top of their head. That was really impressive. So as she said, my name is Vance Crowe, and I am the curiously titled Director of Millennial Engagement. And if I were sitting in your seat, I would imagine right now that you're probably thinking two things. What in the heck is a Director of Millennial Engagement, and why does Monsanto have one? And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but I actually don't want to spend too much time on my work. I want to talk a little bit about what my work has taught me about interacting with people and the need to say things that are uncomfortable, particularly in the face of people that believe very strongly that they know deeply the correct answer, and that when they encounter you, that their responsibility is to change you. And I want to talk about that because I think it's deeply important to your field. And the way that I want to describe how much I've come to this realization is probably to start with my first experience with Monsanto, and it was about 4 years ago. And maybe just as a quick poll in here, how many of you have heard of Monsanto? Okay, now just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard some relatively negative things about Monsanto? Okay, so for anybody in here that doesn't know, Monsanto is an agriculture company. We sell seeds and technologies to farmers to help them solve challenges that they have on the farm. But my first encounter with Monsanto was not at all around that. I had heard that they were interviewing people for this role, Director of Millennial Engagement, and I thought, well, that would be really fun if I could get an interview there, because who doesn't want to see inside of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory? And really at its core, I had a deeply crystallized understanding, or so I thought, of who Monsanto was. As we were hearing just a little bit about my biography, I had spent my entire life up until that point searching the world for how I could make the biggest difference in the world. And I actually think that that is really a very common thing among people of our age, and it actually is only possible because of agriculture. I didn't know this at the time, but if you really think about it, agriculture is freed human beings from needing to say to their children, the best utility that you can have is not to go to school or not to build a future for yourself. It is to go out into the farm, into the fields, and help us get the crops harvested so that we can eat. And so my first experience with Monsanto came on the back of, I had been working in a community public radio station in Northern California. You all have heard of Berkeley, California, right? So I was actually working in Mendocino, California. And if any of you don't know where that is, the people that think Berkeley is too conservative, they moved to Mendocino. And I was working in the back of a train caboose at a community public radio station that was literally publishing the ideas that modern agriculture was a deeply dangerous force in our society. And I didn't necessarily believe or not believe those things. They were just the ideas around me. So you can imagine that when I drove onto the campus of Monsanto, I had a deep image of what I thought this place would be. And I have to tell you that I was horribly disappointed. And maybe to give you an example, it's as I was driving onto the campus, I was imagining that I was going to encounter an 80-story building with dark storm clouds around it, and that everyone in the campus would be walking around with black suits on and Matrix-style sunglasses, and that was not what I experienced. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that story, but I actually have spent quite a bit of time since Christy told me that I was going to have this opportunity thinking about being in this room before you. And I know a few dietitians, and it has really changed my whole view on what it is to have a difficult job. And as I thought about how do you stand up in front of people that I think might actually have one of the most difficult jobs in the world. And that is that people come to you at a time of need, at a time when something has confronted them that they know needs to change. But human beings don't want to change. Human beings want to stay doing what they're doing, and they're coming to you, and you have to have an experience with them that says something deep inside you must be altered in order that you can eat correctly, or deal with this disease that you've been now freshly encountered, or change something about your lifestyle that you don't like about yourself. And actually, as the more and more I've thought about this, the more it's actually kind of an intimidating thing to stand before people and talk about how to be disagreeable or how to disagree effectively when really this is your lives. You are called to the most difficult task, asking people, helping them make a change about who they are. And so when I thought about that, I thought about a story I think Christy has heard me tell before, and it was actually a moment when I was not prepared to need to be able to disagree, to need to be able to step into the fray and make a change. And I think I want to tell that today. Before I worked at Monsanto and before I worked in community public radio, I had been a volunteer with the U.S. Peace Corps. And the reason I had done this, that I had taken this volunteer opportunity is because I had been searching for what is the thing that I can do to do good in the world. And when I encountered the U.S. Peace Corps, I thought, well, this is it. This is how you go out and make a difference in the world. You go volunteer. You go to places somewhere else in the world where there are people that are in deep need, and you go help them. And so I signed up for the U.S. Peace Corps, and my mother is fond of telling everyone that will listen that the Peace Corps, when they were testing my language skills, they tested the Spanish that I had studied so hard in college. They decided, after analyzing my skills, that they were going to send me to Kenya, not a Spanish-speaking country. And so there I was, living on the side of a mountain in the central province of Kenya. And for the first time in my life, I was living in a subsistence farming village. And maybe you have thought about what this means, but I certainly hadn't when I was 22 years old, what it would be like to live in a subsistence village. You see, all of the people there are literally growing the very food that they will eat that day. And so they wake up in the morning, early in the morning, and they send women and children out into the fields. The men often go out and do mining by hand. But the women and children literally spend all day, every day, for the entirety of their lives, bent over pulling weeds out of the ground or picking insects off of their plants because they don't always have access to technology. And so there I was in this village, and I had been tasked with helping them figure out how to solve a terrible problem that that the village had encountered. Malaria had come to this small mountain village. And it had not been there for the hundreds, if not thousands of years that that village had been there, because in the past, if you had gotten sick with malaria down in the valley, by the time you tried to walk up to the village, you were far too sick to make the several-day walking journey up to the town. But because of modernity, because a road had been built to this village that didn't have running water and didn't have electricity, but they had a road, now someone could get sick at the bottom of the mountain and be put into a truck and driven up into the village. And now malaria had spread into this place. But the villagers there, they had no idea where this malaria was coming from. If you don't have electricity or running water and you can't send your children to school, you certainly do not have microbiology classes. You have no one there to teach you that it is the female Anopheles mosquito that comes out only between the hours of 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. at night. And so my job was to help these villagers figure out, how can I prevent my 3-year-old from getting malaria, which increased their likelihood of dying by over 50%. So I would gather every day. I would try and find where the people would gather. And what I found was, at the end of the day, if you've been in a subsistence farm, you gather up whatever produce became ripe that day, and you say, well, this is what my family needs, but anything extra you take into the center of the town. And you lay out a blanket, and you sit down, and you take the produce that you've been producing, and you hope that someone will walk by wanting some tomatoes or wanting some potatoes that you have. And so for me, this was a great gathering point because everybody would come in, and they would share the news of the day, and they would be trading and bartering. But it was also a great opportunity for me to come and teach. And what I would teach with my very rough Swahili skills was I would take out a bed sheet, and I would draw stick figures to show that if you can only keep your 3-year-old child, imagine in equatorial Africa, covered up at night, even though they're crying and even though they don't want to be covered up because it's hot, if you can keep them covered up, you can reduce the space that the mosquitoes could bite them. You could lower the amount of potential for malaria. Or if you had bed nets. And now bed nets don't just work that you place them over. You have to place an insecticide in them. You have to treat them every 3 months. It's a very technical process, so I was teaching that. Or a third option was, if every time it rains and there are puddles all around, if you can then take a little bit of vegetable oil and pour them into the puddles, then you can kill the mosquito eggs that are in the puddles, and hopefully you'll lower the mosquito population. Now, for the first time in my life while I was living in this village, I felt like I was doing good in the world, right? I knew I was making a difference because I was helping people protect their children, and I was actually quite proud of the work that I was doing. Until one day a man came walking into town. And the man was wearing a crisp, clean suit And it's not uncommon for men in East Africa to wear suits, but this one was particularly clean and very well pressed. And the man was carrying an ornate wooden box like this. And he came walking straight into the center of that town, and he set the box down, and he stepped up on top of it. And he said, he didn't even waste a second, he said, "My brothers and sisters, bow your heads and pray." So this very devout community, everybody froze, and they put their heads down, and he rambles through a prayer. And as soon as he's done, he pops his head back up, and he says, "My brothers and sisters, I am here because I have heard a great tragedy is here. I have heard that the scourge of malaria has descended upon this village." And now he has everybody gathering up by him on his box. And he says, "You know, my brothers and sisters, the scourge of malaria touched my life. In fact, it killed my wife and my daughter. And when that happened, I was devastated. So I sold my farm and left my home, and I went wandering the countryside, searching for what could have saved them. And after years and years of searching, I eventually came upon a man by a brook. He was a monk, and he looked deep into my eyes, and he saw how much pain I was in. And so he took water from that brook, water that I have right here. You see, my brothers and sisters, if I had only had this vial of water, I could have poured it into my wash basin with my family, we could have washed ourselves, and they would not have died from malaria." And I remember standing off to the side, kind of with that smirk on your face, the one that only somebody in their 20s that thinks they know what's going on can have. And I was sitting there thinking, buddy, you've come to the wrong town, because I brought science here. But to my horror, literally, every single person gathered around that man on the box found a way to give him 500 Kenyan shillings. That is the equivalent of 2 full days of back-breaking work in the equatorial sun so that they could buy those little vials. And I stood off to the side when this was happening. And I was thinking to myself, what should I do here? Should I go try and shove him off of his box? Should I try and jump in between? Should I yell to the people, "No, he's lying to you"? But I didn't know what to do, and so I didn't do anything at all. I was not prepared for the most important moment of those villagers' lives, and I let that pass by. And it was in that moment that I became very clear that the science is not enough. You must be prepared. You must practice. You have to know how to disagree with people that will come and stand on boxes. Because when I came back to the United States, actually shortly after this occurred, I ended up getting very sick. You guys might appreciate this. You may have encountered this. It turns out that the mango tree is in the same plant family as poison ivy. And as a good Midwestern kid, I am hyper-allergic to poison ivy, but didn't know that little factor of plant biology. So I was covered in head to toe with an allergic reaction, and I was sitting there being like, this would be terrible if I didn't have these mangoes to eat. And so I came back home, and after only a little bit of time, I started to look around and say, wait a second. It isn't just in Africa that men and women will come and stand on boxes. They will come and stand on boxes anywhere where the information is complicated, and they can make it simple and give people, sell people, little vials of water. And so when I took that interview with Monsanto, you can imagine, and this was 10 years later, that it was not within my wildest dreams that I was going to walk into Willy Wonka's chocolate factory and discover anything about a job that I would like to have. But the interview went like this. I end up walking up to the front door, which instead of being an 80-story building looks more like a college campus. It's 2-story buildings, and I walk up to the front door, and the very first person to greet me is a woman named Holly wearing a sweater, and she has a ponytail, and she's like, "Come on in." And so we go in and we do interviews. But if you've ever interviewed for a job that you don't want, it's actually a fantastically fun experience because you don't have to answer any of the questions they have for you. Instead, you can sit there and poke and try and prod. And I was there to discover why this place was so evil. So I was asking them all the questions, all of the things that I had heard along the way. And I had about 7 hours worth of interviews, so I got to poke a whole bunch. And we get all the way to the end of the interview for a job I don't want. And the woman that greeted me at the front door, Holly, says, "Do you have any questions for me now that we're done?" And I said, "Yeah. How are you going to train this person to be the director of Millennial Engagement for Monsanto?" And she paused and said something that changed the rest of my life. She said, "You know, at Monsanto, we are very big on training people, very individually. And for you, if you took this job, I would set up a training program for you. What I would do, since you've been so curious, since you've poked so much, what I would do is I would line up a list of interviews for 50 people from throughout the company, geneticists, biologists, breeders, chemists, farmers, attorneys, people from throughout the company, and you go sit down with each of them for an hour. Ask them whatever you want, and then when you're done, come and sit down and talk with me, and we'll figure out what you do and don't know, and then we'll write you another list of 50 people to go talk to." And in this moment, I realized that, wait a second, she's handing me something. And what she's handing me is the opportunity to run around and find out, is this company as evil as everyone thinks that they are? Because if they are, then I'm going to go write the greatest tell-all book of all time. But if they're not, then you have literally just discovered potentially the most important problem that needs to be solved in the modern age, which is that we are growing food more bountifully than we have ever grown it before in the history of time, and yet people have been made to feel suspicious, then afraid, and then angry. And so I took that job. And that is what led me to being here. But I want to talk with you a little bit about where this fear has potentially come from. This is a graphic that shows the number of people living and working on farms since the 1900s. And in 1900s, it was 42% of the population. Now, it is less than 2%. Now, you often see graphs like this where they go, down and to the right, but there's something deeper going on here. You see, this graphic actually represents the largest migration of human beings in the history of time. More people have moved from living in the countryside to now living in cities than in any other time. More people are moving, changing radically their lives. And this transition that has happened in the United States has happened in the entire Western world, and it is going on globally all over the world. In fact, just 4 years ago, 50% of the world's population moved into cities. So now there are more people globally living in cities than living in the countryside, and this has never happened before. But if you look at this graphic, you can also recognize that as people picked themselves up and they dusted themselves off from working in the fields, as they walked into town, that dust built up into a mountain. And that mountain now separates the people living in the city from the people working and living on the farms. So you can imagine that there are many, many myths and many things, stories that the people living in the city have heard about the people living on the farms. But this brings me to something that I think you all are probably intimately familiar with, although maybe you haven't actually heard it named. There is an effect called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is, it describes how much confidence you have in what you know about a subject. And it turns out that you can put this on a graph, your confidence in your expertise relative to the amount of time you've spent studying it. And it's a very funny thing, and this has been replicatable across multiple fields. But it turns out that when you first start learning about something, your confidence in how much you know skyrockets. You read that one book about economics, or you watch that one documentary about your diet, or you read one book about gluten or protein or paleo. And the confidence that you have that you know everything there is to know skyrockets. But then something happens. As you start to learn more and more, your confidence in what you know begins to go down. And the reason that it goes down is the more that you learn, the more you start realizing how much you don't know. And so all of you students that have gotten into the dietetics program, you have entered, I'm certain, this area right here, which they call the trough of disillusionment, right? It's where you're like, I don't know how much more there is to know, but I keep going down and not up. But as I understand this group, there are also those of you that do hit the bottom of that trough, and you do understand how much there is to know, and you begin to specialize, and you start having confidence in the area that you've specialized. This is very important because this effect is where men and women can come and stand on boxes. And they can do it through documentaries, they can do it through memes, they can do it through word of mouth, or different types of fields that will say, don't worry about all the details, let me just tell you a story about how this works. And so the challenge is, how are you, somebody that is in this either trough of disillusionment or moving up on expertise, to deal with people that have an overabundance of confidence in what they know? And so what people know, that's an interesting concept, right? How do people know what they know? So this is a word. What is that? How do you say that word? Who knows? Memes, right? 3 years ago, when I used to ask this question, people would be like, memes, memes, right? But it has actually permeated society. We all know what this is. But I would actually wonder if you really know what this word means. Because we think of it as a new word, but it was coined in the 1970s by an evolutionary biologist by the name of Richard Dawkins, who wrote in a book called The Selfish Gene that one of the great advantages that human beings have over other animals is that we don't have to have all of our knowledge encoded into our DNA or taught to us every single step of the way. Instead, what we do is that we can compress vast amounts of information and share them with other people so that you don't have to have all of the experiences that I've had to know how to interact with the world. And so I'll give you some examples. This woman up here, does anybody know who this is? It's kind of an older meme, overly attached girlfriend, right? And how do you know? Because she's got these big bulging eyes. And anytime she has something, it's always about a relationship, like, I sewed my name on your shirt in case you forget you're taken, right? And we can laugh about this, but I would actually make the case that this meme is doing real work. Imagine that you're a freshman in college, you're away from your parents for the first time, and you get into a romance, and that romance feels so torrid and exciting and amazing, and you've got all of these chemicals running through you, and all you want to do is spend all of your time with this person, and what you can begin to forget is the reality that two people don't need to spend all of their time together. And so if you are out on the internet and you encounter this meme, you may ask yourself, wait a second, am I being overly attached girlfriend or boyfriend? I don't want to be that. So these can serve as a sort of warning track. Or this guy right here, he's known as Good Guy Greg. Now, here what he's saying is, knows you're nervous during a presentation, smiles and nods every time you make eye contact, hint, 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 right? And what's the value of this? Well, imagine that you're a young person that wants to figure out how to be cool, how to interact with the rest of the world, but you don't have that cousin or that friend or that brother or sister that tells you, hey, be cool like this. Instead, you can find memes like this that can show you how to be warm, how to make connections with other people. But memes aren't just photos with writing on them. For example, this meme right here, what do you think most people think this is when I show it to a regular audience? They think of it as GMOs, right? Which is interesting because there are no GMO tomatoes available on the market, and we don't make GMOs using syringes. So why is this the meme, right? Why is this the idea that everybody has? So when I put that up there, why does everybody know that that's GMO? Well, it's because the activists, the people that want to create fear, know how to short-circuit regular people's thinking as they're on that beginning confidence of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what they also know is that there are only two things that people are more afraid of than needles, and that's death and public speaking, right? And so if you can associate needles with genetic engineering, you don't need to talk about the details of how they work or if they're safe or if they're not. You've made an association that is gripping in people's minds. Now, this other meme right here, the USDA organic, the people sitting at this table right here, I assure you, they know deeply what that means. All of the parameters around it, what it says, the fact that it's actually run out of the marketing department of USDA, not some other scientific part. Now, the interesting thing about this meme is that it means a lot to consumers. They go to grocery stores and they believe deeply that it tells them something about their food, about its healthiness or its nutrition. When really, we, the people that understand about this label, it doesn't mean that at all. But then there's some darker things. There are some darker ideas and memes that get expressed, and I put them up here as photos, but you should know that these are people that go around and they speak. This woman here, her name is Vandana Shiva. She was on that radio station several times when I worked there. And she goes around and gives talks at universities all around the country, really all around the world. And she says things that people would all inherently agree with at first. And what she'll say is, we want to make sure that disenfranchised or people that are marginalized in their communities aren't taken advantage of by major corporations. Well, everyone in this room, including myself, would agree with that. We don't want that. And so she gets people nodding their heads yes. And then she slots in, you cannot insert a gene you took from bacteria into a seed and call it life. You haven't created a life, you have only polluted it. She's not talking about how the engineering works or the value of it to farmers or its safety. What she's saying is, you should just know that this is bad. It is polluted. Or this one right here, this may be somebody that you are all familiar with, a woman named Vani Hari, or the Food Babe. She publishes memes like this, and you may not be able to read it, but this is an infographic that she's saying, this is what is hidden inside of your pumpkin spice latte. And it says things like, absolutely no real pumpkin, toxic doses of sugar, made with what she calls Monsanto milk, which is cows fed corn that's genetically engineered. Now, the reason that this is so dark and deeply insidious is something that you can actually go home and test with your family, or if you have a roommate or one of your colleagues. When you go home today, take a glass of water and sit across the table from your friend. And push the water over to your friend, look down at the water, look back up at your friend, look back down at the water, smile, and look back up at your friend. Are they going to drink that water? Hell no, they're not going to drink that water. No, right? And the reason that we are all in here in this room today after tens of thousands of generations is because our ancestors did not drink the water that they thought things were hidden inside of. So if you can just trigger people to believe that they know that there is something hidden in there, you can spark that fear, and that fear allows a man or a woman to come and stand on a box and say, let me tell you how to deal with that fear. Let me tell you about what you should know about your food. And this brings up an interesting, I've never had a musical background before. This brings up an interesting thing. As I was working through, Monsanto gave me months and months to go and really understand why is it that people believe what they believe. And I encountered an artificial intelligence researcher by the name of Yosha Bach out of MIT. And what Yosha studies is, we want to get computers to think like human beings. But if you want computers to think like human beings, you first have to know, how do human beings think? How do they know what they know? And he came up with this very interesting series of studies, and after 10 years, he stands up in this community and he talks about, we have done 10 years of research on this, and what we have discovered is that human beings know hardly anything at all, right? Which is kind of funny. But in reality, it's the truth, right? We don't have the time or the intellect or the resources or access to know everything around us. And instead, what Yosha says is that we begin to learn things deeply, one or two areas. And then we rely on our tribe. That should say tribe, but I have it in white writing. So we rely on our tribe to help us understand the other parts of the world that we don't know about. So if, for example, I encounter a new idea, something I've never heard before, well, I have no idea whether I should believe that, whether it's good, whether it's bad. So when I encounter that idea, I go to my tribe. And what I mean by my tribe is the people that I go to church with, or play sports with, or raise my children with, or the people that I see when I'm online on Reddit or maybe Facebook. And I turn to that tribe and I say, hey guys, I heard this new thing, what do you think? So for example, the idea is, hey, did you know that chemicals are being used to grow our food? Well, if I don't know anything at all about that, then I'm going to turn to my tribe and I'm going to say, what do we think about that? Now that tribe, they may or may not have very much information at all on that subject. So they're going to give me an answer back. And I'm going to take that answer and I'm going to put it out into the world. But I don't now know this deeply. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm putting out a symbol of my group loyalty. People that think like my tribe, we think like this. And herein lies the problem. Because if somebody with a deep expertise in a subject comes along and says, wait a second, that idea that you just put out there, that's not right, it's wrong. And here's why, and here's the evidence. The person that put that idea out there as a symbol of their group loyalty, when that idea gets shot at, they don't view it as you shooting at their idea. They view it as you shooting at their tribe. Which now puts us in a terrible paradox. Because if people don't know things based on actual data and evidence, well then, how do you change the way that they think? How do you get them to believe or to know what the evidence actually says? And this leads me to, I think, maybe the most important point of my talk. And that is that you all, in the dietetics community, are freedom fighters. And I mean that in a very real way. Because the fear that people are putting in, the fear that the tribes of people, whether they're from yoga or basketball or any other different tribe, the fear that is spreading into these people, it crushes under them. You must see this every day in your lives. The people that come in, and yes, they have a deep belief in what they know, but they have also come to that conclusion and it weighs down on them if it's not actually correct. And the people that are going out and spreading misinformation, they are actually targeting the most vulnerable people that are out in the world. And as I have gone further and further into this job, the more that I thought Monsanto was one thing, and now I've started to encounter the people that are spreading fear, I've encountered some things that were pretty uncomfortable. And I actually asked Christy if I could share this, because I think it might make you guys a little bit uncomfortable as well. But I think it's important so that you understand. This man here, his name is Jeffrey Smith. He runs the Institute for Responsible Technology out of a small town in Fairfield, Iowa. That is where the place that the non-GMO movement really began. And if you watch, there's a new documentary out there called Food Evolution, where they talk about the different perspectives of genetic engineering. You'll see that this man, who is not a doctor and doesn't have any formal training in dietetics, he's actually a professional ballroom dancer that now runs this institute. He speaks to the legislatures in Hawaii, to the Ugandan government, travels around Africa. But you should listen to what he says, because what he is saying here, he's talking about what should we do now that mandatory GMO labeling did not become law? What should we do? And what he says is, don't worry, we're going to do the same thing we've always done. And I want to let you listen to this. The sound's on for this?
Great way to convey the messaging. And so we might lose that. But we don't need it. We know exactly what to say and who to say it to. We know who are the most receptive demographic groups to switch to non-GMO eating. And if you think about it, so do you. Moms. Especially moms with children who are suffering from chronic conditions or those who are trying to prevent those chronic conditions. That is the key group. Also, another form of mom, pet owners. More and more pet owners and veterinarians are telling us that when they take their pets off of GMOs, they get better. Another group are those suffering from the chronic conditions that are linked to GMOs. And when they find out that GMOs may be the cause, they're more likely to switch and try it out. And then those that take care of those people, the healthcare practitioners, thousands of which are now prescribing non-GMO diets. And finally, there's the religious people who believe GMO means God move over, who are religiously against GMOs and are looking for an opportunity to express their religious beliefs in their actions. So we have 5 targeted demographic groups, and we have a 5-year master plan to eliminate GMOs. We think we can get rid of it in direct food within 2 to 3 years and animal feed within 5 years.
So I'll let you go look up the rest of that talk so you can understand the context if I'm representing it correctly, but I believe it's a very important thing to think about who they're targeting. They're not just targeting moms, they're targeting moms with children with chronic conditions. They're not just targeting people that are sick, they're targeting the healthcare workers that take care of the people that are sick. They are deeply interested in making sure the people that are the most vulnerable, the people that need a solution the most, are the ones that they propagate their information to. So this brings me to the concept of how can you prepare yourself? Because I was not prepared for what to do when the man came and stood on the box in my village. And yet you encounter people all the time that have been persuaded by men and women that stand on boxes. And the first thing that I want to share with you is something that it's going to challenge you. And I think you should reflect back on your education. At the times when you were in the trough of disillusionment and things got really, really tough, but there was always that one professor or that one book that you read or that one experience that you had that allowed you to become fascinated with your field. The thing that made you go, oh my gosh, look at how truly amazing the human nutrition system is. And if you can remember those, you can actually have a fascinating experience with people. And I'll give you an example. When I'm out in the world and I am speaking to audiences, there are occasionally people that believe that because I work at Monsanto, I am a manifestation of evil. And they truly believe that what I am saying is really dark. And so they bravely stand up in front of a room of people like this, and they walk to the microphone, and they maybe are shaking as they ask this question. And they ask me a question about GMOs and their safety. If I come back at that person as hard as I can, I spend time with literally the best molecular biologists in the world. So I know the responses deeply. But if I come back and hit that person as hard as I can with facts, we won't get anywhere. But what I discovered was the story of broccoli, which is really a fascinating story. I had no idea, maybe you guys know this, but I had literally no idea that broccoli did not occur in the wild. We didn't just go collect wild broccoli and put it into straight rows. That's not how it worked. In fact, what happened was there was a plant, we now have it as a Latin name of Brassica oleracea. It would grow to be very tall, and it would come up on riverbanks. And the great thing about this plant is if you were a hunter and gatherer, then you could encounter this plant and you could eat almost the entire thing. It had these dark green leaves that were really bitter. It had these seed pods, and it had little lateral buds, and it had a nice stalk that would come out on the sides. And the amazing thing was, as people began to eat this plant, if instead, when they found them growing along the riverbank, if instead of eating all of the plants, they took the one with the bushiest seed pods and said, we're going to take those seed pods and we're going to plant them in the ground. Then the next year, the children of that plant have bushier seed pods. And if, out of all of those, you select the one with the bushiest seed pods again, and you keep doing this a few thousand times, it overexpresses, and the bushy seed pods become a plant that is broccoli. But the other amazing thing about Brassica oleracea, this wild cabbage, it actually gives us a whole bunch of the vegetables that we eat. Cabbage, those lateral buds that I was talking about, those are Brussels sprouts. The dark green leaves, that's where kale comes from. All of those were selected for. And when I talk about this with somebody that has brought me a question, now we come to a new place because I've shown them something that was fascinating to me and maybe was fascinating to them. And so we start an entirely different conversation. The next thing is a concept called mirroring. So if you encounter somebody that you believe knows deeply about the subject that you're talking about, and they've brought a lot of emotion to it, and this could be true with somebody in your dietetics program, or it might work well in your marriage. I can tell you it's very helpful in mine, which is this concept called mirroring. You see, when people encounter stress and they start disagreeing, one of the reasons that they raise their voices is because they think the other person isn't hearing them. And so a fascinating thing to do, and it feels awkward at first because you're going to say, they're going to know I'm pulling this rabbit out of the hat, that the rabbit's been there all the time, but it's actually a really fascinating thing to do. If instead of disagreeing with someone right away, you mirror back for them exactly what you heard them say. And you say, what I'm hearing you say is, and then talk about the thing that they've just said. When they hear that you are repeating back for them, there's a fascinating thing that happens. It changes where in their brain they process information. It changes how they've heard what they have just said. And so it opens them up to being willing to talk about the idea from a different perspective. Steel manning your critics. This is a very important concept, particularly when you're talking with people that have read one book or watched 2 documentaries. You, as a person that they're coming to as a professional, you can watch these documentaries and you can laugh at just how crazy they are, or just how little science they are, or how ridiculous they are. But if you laugh but do not watch them, then you have no idea what it is that they're coming in with. If you find out there's a new documentary, although it may be painful for somebody with your expertise in the field, you must watch them and read them, because you have to know their arguments better than they do. And the reason that you have to is if somebody comes to you with a complaint and they're on that Dunning-Kruger with the overconfidence in how much they know, if you are able to say, you're right, I've heard that discussion before, the author also said this and this and this, and you, instead of tearing down what small argument they have or what small perspective they have on why you're wrong about dietetics, then you can show them how much you know about it. And it turns out, by showing them how much you know about it, you're reflecting back a respect for what they've listened to, for what they've watched, for what they've come to believe. And it's a concept called steel manning your critics, and it is a very powerful tool that's been used all the way since Aristotle was teaching about philosophy. And then finally, this concept of practice speaking the truth. As you were saying before in your introduction, there are times when it is so much easier just to not have conflict, to let those things pass. But I can tell you that the fear about people's food is not going to get easier tomorrow. And tomorrow, it's going to be more complicated. There's going to be more misinformation. There's going to be more things that people have become afraid of. And so it is best to start today at figuring out, can I be disagreeable in this one conversation? Can I try and change their perspective instead of letting it float? And what you'll find is, as you get better with these skills of mirroring people, of reflecting back for them their arguments, that you feel a little stronger. And then you go and you are more willing to pick up other rocks that are bigger and more challenging conversations. And it is deeply important because one day it may be a person that is standing before you that doesn't know what they should eat now that they've got a new illness that they have to face, or somebody that wants to make a big change. Each one of those moments is a human being's life, and you need to be as strong as possible to be able to help them change in their moment of need. I'm going to finish by talking about some people that I think are interesting. I don't know, how many of you are on Twitter? A few? I think Twitter is a fascinating place for ideas to be spread among people that are talking, are what we would say are the ones that are sharing maybe ideas before other people get to them, before they make it to the mainstream. But if not Twitter, they have other things. There is a dietitian named Leah McGrath. She lives in North Carolina. She is fascinating on Twitter. She spends all of her time connecting different people and saying, you have this question? Well, let me connect you with an expert that knows about this subject. She's interesting, she's plucky, she's always upbeat, and I think she's a breath of fresh air. In fact, she is one of the first dietitians that I ever met, and I met her on Twitter. You could become a dietitian, the first dietitian that someone has ever met, or the first dietitian that can answer questions that a person otherwise can only go to documentaries and books for. This other person that I mentioned here, her name is Rachel Loudon, and she has a blog called rachelloudon.com, but she wrote a very, very interesting, I think it's like a 20-page book, and it's called A Plea for Culinary Modernism. It's so common that we hear people talk about, oh, it used to be so much better. I wish food could be like it was in my grandma's time. Or I've heard it said, I wish we could go back to what the Native Americans ate. And Rachel's book, Dr. Loudon's book, talks about what food was really like. And she goes through and she analyzes old cookbooks to say, why did the cookbooks all use lard? Or why were regional cookbooks so important? And were the French really eating baguettes and croissants back in the day? No. They were actually eating peasant food, which was very different. And so if you want somebody that's talking about a historical context and is able to make it brilliant and exciting, I recommend Rachel Loudon. If you're interested in connecting with farmers or people that are talking about issues that are close to what's going on in the farming community, these are two people This woman over here, Leslie Ray Kelly, she runs a blog called High Heels and Canola Fields. She's Canadian, and she is out there talking about what it's like to be a young mom living in the city, but having a husband that works on a farm. What are the issues she has with grocery shopping and other issues? And this guy right here is a farmer from Illinois named Rob Sharkey. And he actually has a podcast with Leslie called The Farmer and the City Girl. And every week, it's 30 minutes talking about how do you read labels? Hey, what pesticides are farmers actually using? It's a very, very interesting podcast. And if you're a person that's on Twitter, every Monday night at 6 p.m., they have the Farmer and the City Girl chat, which brings in all sorts of farmers, but also young moms that are out there talking. And the dietetics community is way underrepresented. You could be there to be a force for evidence and knowledge about your subject. And there are people there that will be very interested in your expertise. And finally, because I wanted to throw in an idea that may be very far away from this community, but one I think that's worth hearing about, there's a group of people in the world that have it in their minds that the environment used to be treated so much better, that agriculture used to be more in tandem with the earth. And so in the 1970s, when the green movement got started, that changed the whole dialogue about what it is to be an environmentalist. And some of the very people that started that movement got together in April of 2015. And they said, how is our environmental movement going that we've done? And they came to an agreement that the environmental movement has become less about protecting the environment and more about stopping technologies. And so they wrote a document. It's 30 pages long, and it's called an Eco-Modernist Manifesto. And it is redefining what it is to be an environmentalist in a technological age. If you want to preserve as much land for hiking and running and biking or fishing and hunting, then instead of going in the opposite direction of saying you should use less technology, they're saying let's use more of the right technology so that we can grow more in less land. This can be a door for you to open up and show someone that believes very deeply that the way that they are eating is helping or hurting the environment. This is a different way of looking at it. So I'm going to finish by saying, if you can change how you see yourself, I know because my wife went from being an aerospace engineer to becoming a physical therapist, that she had to transition from being a numbers person that was very detail-oriented and pushing metal pieces together to get them to fly through the air, to now working with people that have been through surgery or a tragic accident, that she had to change how she saw herself. She had to change how much empathy she could bring to things, but also being able to say, let me help you stop some of the misinformation that you have, that the tools that you've had in the past aren't going to work for you. So she's had to change herself in order to change the world. And I believe that is true of you. If you're encountering people and you're not willing to be disagreeable, to run into and encounter the things that they think, then you won't be ready at the moment that is the time most in need. And I have this slide back here, and it's maybe just a way to close out, which this looks like a galaxy, right? Or maybe a brain map, right? This is a photo that I found talking with some of the data science people inside of Monsanto. And I think it's actually a fascinating thing. You see, Monsanto itself doesn't always see itself as a data company. We want to be, but we don't always see ourselves that. And it was when we found this photo. This photo is actually a family tree of all of the inbred corn lines that we use to grow more bountiful corn. And when you start showing this as a family tree, all of the dots are different inbred lines, and all of the lines in between them are where we've made crosses to grow more bountiful corn. When we started showing this inside of the company, people changed how they saw themselves, and they changed how they went out and represented themselves, which is actually emblematic of Monsanto hiring a director of Millennial Engagement. So thank you so much for your time here today. I appreciate it, and if we still have time, I'd love to take questions. Okay. Thank you. Oh, there it is.
So we have a couple mics. We have plenty of time for questions. So anyone have any questions? Yeah. Can we get one more? We need one more. Thanks. Right behind you. Hi, Kathleen.
Can you explain just a little bit more about what Monsanto does and some of the things you've discovered that you think really adds to changing the world?
I only caught the beginning of that question. I didn't catch the
Oh,
end.
could you explain a little more about what Monsanto does and what you have discovered that you think they are doing that really changes the world?
So Monsanto the name Monsanto is a 100-year-old company. It started out as a chemical company, and they actually, if you go on YouTube, you can look up Monsanto House of the Future. So they used to be in things like plastics, and at Disneyland, they actually had exhibits of the types of plastics and chemistry that Monsanto was doing. But in the 90s, they were spun off from the chemical company, and they became an entirely agriculture company. So we started primarily in seeds. So how can we breed the best seeds that are possible? But then as we've grown over time, we've started doing things like, we have a company called the Climate Corporation, which allows us to link up satellites to be able to incorporate with the GPS-guided tractors what is the exact right seed to plant in the exact right soil conditions. So you could move forward 10 meters and be planting a different seed based on what is the exact right conditions. We also do things like produce herbicides. So there's a common herbicide called Roundup that we were able to make the plants so they weren't killed when you sprayed Roundup over them, but you could kill the weeds. So it made it so 15-year-olds weren't going out in the fields and hoeing them up. We do a whole bunch of other things like fungicides on seeds, but maybe that's enough detail, or do you want more? Okay. Other questions? Here in the front.
I'm just curious, what are some of the things that Monsanto does as a company to protect biodiversity and to secure our food supply?
So biodiversity is a very complex word, right? It seems like a very simple thing, but since Egyptian times, as soon as you start planting crops, what you do is you say, we want wheat here and no other crops because it can grow more bountifully. But then if you knock out all of the other things around there, then you start limiting the amount of other plants that are native to the area. So Monsanto does many different things, but maybe more specifically to your point, when we plant a specific crop like cotton or corn, if we have a trait inside of that seed, many people think corn is just one thing, but as you can see here, it's actually really, really diverse number of corn lines that have come into one corn plant. And then inside of that bag, some of the seeds have the specific traits, like a thing called BT, so it actually protects it from insects. But 15% of the seeds don't have that in it at all. So that way, if there were insects that eat corn, they're going to eat the ones without the BT and instead of the ones with BT, so that way you don't make it so there's no food at all for the insects there. So you allow the insects that are natively there. The other thing that we do is by allowing there to be more precision in the planting, you've actually opened it up so that farmers can have closer rows to where they allow creek beds to run or different areas where there's timber, because you're able to use the land that you have already drawn out much more efficiently. You can plant and use your ground, but then also preserve more because you're producing more on this set of land. And then we also have a project with the monarch butterflies, which are, in the past, milkweed was a very invasive species, but milkweed is the only plant that monarch butterflies can plant their egg larvae on. And so at first, we were really happy to help the farmers get rid of all the milkweed out of their fields because it would clog up their combines, it would choke out the other plants. But we now have seen, we want to be able to make it so the monarch butterflies can migrate from Canada all the way down to Mexico. So we've partnered with groups like Purina and Land O'Lakes to get what we call refuge. So we actually send out milkweed seeds to farmers and help them figure out where can we plant this so that as the monarch butterflies fly down the continental United States, there are enough spots for them to be able to land and lay their eggs and continue the migration process.
I have a question. I actually have a microphone. I'm interested that your title is Millennial Engagement, because your message was very different than what I was expecting because of that. So do you position your message differently because you're the Millennial Engagement Director? The man from Iowa is certainly not that generation, so help me understand a little bit how you direct your message.
So when I first came in after I accepted the job, I then had to, well, after I decided I wanted that job, then I had to go talk with my wife and say, hey, you know that job I was interviewing for that I didn't want? Now I actually want it. And so, but then on day one, when I came into the job, I came to my boss and said, we got to change that title because everybody's going to make fun of me when I go out into public, right? Director of Millennial Engagement, that's super awkward. And she said, okay, you can change it if, titles are not that important here. And I actually, in that time, I had about 6 months where I was interviewing all of these people throughout the company, and I was asking them, what would you be called? What would you be called? And I encountered a man named Rob Long, who actually made a really good point about why do we name generations? And, because we know there are more young people coming, so why do we name them baby boomers and Gen X and Gen Z and millennials? Well, really, the reason that we name generations is not to represent that young people are coming. Really, it's to say there are random ideas that are crashing together, like out in the ocean, that don't actually amount to be anything. They could be 60 feet tall, but because they're not in sync, they crash and disintegrate. But every once in a while, because of changes to technology or government or pop culture, some of those ideas which were random start getting into sync, and they form into a tidal wave that will one day crash onto the shore of society. And it won't become society, but it will change the shape of that shore. So when we say millennials, what we're really saying is, where is the cultural wave, and how can you get to the top of that wave, where the most important ideas are about to diffuse into society? Dietitians, for example. But I actually spend a great deal of time with synthetic biologists who are doing very advanced, some might say radical changes to genetic engineering that are not with Monsanto, talking with them about what does the public know, what should you be doing to relay to them. I speak with groups like the Skeptics group. Are you guys familiar with the Skeptics? You guys might find this group interesting. You guys have all heard of Penn and Teller. So what are they? Magicians, right? But I would actually make the case that Penn is a professional skeptic. What he does is he says, what do we know to be scientifically true? And where are there people that are the furthest away from that are selling things we know aren't true, like palm reading or astrology? And then what he does is he goes and he interviews them and asks them what they do or, why are they selling this? What do they actually believe? And he records it. And then he puts it on television and pulls the curtain off to show how far they are away from the science. And he does this in a form of humor. He makes a lot of jokes about it. And he had this show on Showtime called Bullshit. Well, that is actually the skeptics community, and it's not just that show. They are a global community. Almost assuredly, there's a skeptics community here in Salt Lake City, and they are literally all over the world. They're in Glasgow, Scotland, in London, Australia, and so part of my work is to go to those audiences, and if I'm willing to stand up and answer their questions, those are the very people that go out on the internet and talk and make new memes and reply, and they are, while I would say most people in the healing arts are very agreeable people, oftentimes the skeptics are very disagreeable, so they don't mind going into the fray. So my work is less about changing the message and more about finding who's at the top of that wave that we should go speak with.
I just want to, first of all, thank you for being here. I think you have a very strong voice and very motivational, and you have inspired at least me to be the best that I can be. My question, I actually worked at Bayer Crop Science before they bought you guys back in 2014. So my question is more along the science side, because you have said you speak with and converse with a lot of scientists. So I want to talk specifically about glyphosate and what are your thoughts on it, how it metabolizes in the body, and specifically the suppression of cytochrome P450?
So that actually is more of a technical question than I can answer. I can refer you to people that can answer it. So just a couple of clarifying things. Bayer has made the announcement that they're going to purchase Monsanto, but the deal has not gone through, so it's subject to regulatory approval. So Monsanto is actually being purchased by Bayer, who is a large player in the ag world, but also a big player in pharmaceuticals and home care products. So now they're going to become, when the deal goes through, the largest agriculture company in the world. with regards to glyphosate, I can give you kind of a surface answer and then reflect you on people or places that you could go to get a deeper answer, which is glyphosate, the way that it works is that it tells the plant, when you spray it over top of it, it's a very low toxicity. So the LD level of glyphosate is, caffeine is more toxic than glyphosate, for example. So there's an interesting property, though. When you spray glyphosate over the plant, it essentially tells the plant, stop the photosynthetic process. Don't make food anymore. And so the plant then shuts down, and it basically, over about 2 weeks, starves itself to death. Now, there's been some questions about how much glyphosate is on food. There's been activists that have gone out and said there are parts per billion out there, and it's showing up in things like urine. And we have deep concern with this. So Monsanto and many, many others, universities all over the world, different health organizations, there's over 200 studies in the United States in the last 6 years alone, have said, is this a problem? Is the LD level of the residues that are on food that make it into human consumption, does this have any impact on human beings? And the evidence says no. But to answer your more specific question, I would have to refer you to either an outside group like the Genetic Literacy Project or some of the more formal industry groups like GMO Answers to answer that specifically technical question.
Thank you.
Any other questions, thoughts? I have one for you. So one of the things that I've found success with when I talk to people about agriculture and farming and what we need to do to solve this problem of feeding the world, or how we just proceed in the future, is talking about the fact that we can learn from a lot of different sectors of agriculture. We use biotechnology and learn from that, but also learn from what's going on in organic farming and take the best things from all these worlds and use them to improve our food supply. And so what would you say to that? Because I think, well, at least what I've heard, the consensus is that GMOs and technology is one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the panacea for the future of agriculture. So what do you think about that?
So genetic engineering is a very important technology, but it's right now only in a very small number of crops. And one of the reasons that it's in such a small number of crops is that the regulatory pressure when you go to get a genetically engineered change in corn or cotton, for example, it requires, after you've done the research and the development and you've spent tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions to get it, now you start on average a 13-year regulatory process. Each one of those years costs $10 million at least. So you're talking about $130 million of regulatory burden. And what that means is only the largest companies can afford to do genetic engineering, which then has limited the number of crops that have been there. But no one at Monsanto has said our entire company is genetic engineering. And in fact, in no biotech companies, none of the other companies, Syngenta, Bayer, BASF, any of the other ones, say that, because genetic engineering is for a very specific set of problems. And there are other things like fungicides that you can place on the outside of a seed that keeps an insect from eating it before it starts growing. That's a very important technology. Or like the satellite technology that I was talking about, where you can now integrate the GPS of the tractors to change which seeds they're planting, or things like refuge in a bag, or figuring out how can you make changes to what the seed, what different types of seeds you use have an impact on the crops. In fact, at Monsanto, and I would guess this is true of the other companies as well, more than 50% of our R&D budget is actually on just regular breeding. So just, this is a really good female plant, this is a really good male plant, let's cross them together. We're doing it at the molecular level. We're using very sophisticated data techniques to do that, but most of our budget is in things like traditional breeding and other parts of the technology. However, that said, there are a lot of problems that farmers have that genetic engineering would be a part of really helping solve them, so that we could use things like less pesticides or less passes over the field with tractors. Every time a farmer pulls up that tractor to go spray on the field, we are using very safe chemistries, but you're also talking about a giant diesel engine that is cranking through diesel and fuel and putting that up in the air. So every time that we can invent a technology that requires a farmer to spend less time away from his family out in the field, and then also putting that up into the air. So it's a very diverse, varied ways to solve problems that farmers have.
Hi, I'm just going to piggyback on maybe your answer from 2 questions ago, but you've obviously have a lot of access to the scientists and inside of Monsanto. Do you have more recommendations on how we as medical professionals can access that information if we want to learn more?
So your question was, as medical professionals, where would I recommend to go to get access to the same level of technology that I've gotten, or same level of information?
Yep.
So that's a great question. I mentioned one called GMO Answers, which is an industry group that has come together and said, we will have some of our experts, whether they're in toxicology or chemistry or breeding, we will have them take a part of their day to answer literally any question that somebody asks. So you can go there and look through all the questions that other people have asked, but then also ask your own questions. There's another project called the Genetic Literacy Project, which is actually just a compilation of a whole lot of biotech issues or concerns that are out in the world, and they go out and find a scientist, but it's completely separate from the biotech industry. They just do it on their own. There's a podcast that I actually think, if you're into podcasts, I love them, called Talking Biotech. And it is a professor from the University of Florida who interviews all sorts of people about the deep issues that they know about. And Kevin, Dr. Folta's real expertise is in taking a really scientific answer and making it simple for regular people to understand. And I think the value with that for you is you can then identify who are the experts that you can then, almost all of them are on Twitter, so you can ask them directly, or you can take the show notes that are from Kevin's podcast. So you can go the formal route, GMO Answers, you can go the less formal genetic literacy, or be finding podcasts like Talking Biotech. Does that address your question?
Yes, it does. It's hard to know, to find those quality resources, so that's a good start.
I would say many universities in the United States right now have agricultural sciences programs, and if you were to if you were to go to their websites and find out who's doing their research, I have found that they will send me papers that they've published. It's incredibly easy to get people to share information, particularly if you say, this is what I'm encountering and I want to know what the correct answer is. I've found professors to be incredibly open with sharing their information.
Thanks.
So I know that there are a lot of documentaries on Monsanto. I was wondering if there are any that you have seen that you think give a fair view of it.
Great question. So there are 2 documentaries that are relatively new that I think are probably worth checking out. One I've seen, and one I know, I've met the executive producer, so I haven't seen it, but I know what direction her work was going in. And the first one is called GMO Evolution, or no, I'm sorry, Food Evolution. And it's narrated by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and it goes through and it talks about what are the problems that farmers have, why do you use things like genetic engineering, and what are the social issues around all of this. So that's a really powerful one, and they have the long version, which I recommend, and I've heard the short version is pretty good, it's about 50 minutes. And then the other one is a documentary called Science Moms, and it actually was a woman that had become a mother, and she became super concerned about where her food was coming from and what was going on. She happened to have friends that were scientists, molecular breeders, and geneticists. So she started asking them all these questions, and she realized, hey, wait a second, if I have all these questions, surely somebody else has them. And so she just I think a week ago, launched this documentary that she's been building for the last year and a half called Science Moms, where they go and interview women scientists that are also our mothers that are talking about how should you think about your food.
As
Wow,
I'm
you guys
walking
got
over-
warmed up. Now there's more questions. Okay.
As I'm walking over to the, just Food Evolution is streaming on Hulu right now. Otherwise, there's just private screenings that are kind of around.
You can also get it on iTunes. I think it's like $2.99 on iTunes. Okay. And Science Moms, I just downloaded it. I haven't watched it yet. Is $4.
So I have a question right here. As a farmer perspective, my father-in-law owns, well, they used to own about 6,500 acres in northern Utah. My question is your company doing anything to help save these jobs that you talked about, farming declining? It's really hard to keep these farmers to pass on to their sons. For example, my husband left the farming business, went to the corporate world because he could earn more money, he could provide for his family much better, and the hard work in the fields wasn't as long on him. However, I feel like these old timers or these farmers have a lot of information and they're very knowledgeable about their farms. Is there anything that your company is doing to help save these jobs or to educate those that may have these so that these farms aren't going away and selling them to real estate or other means?
So that is an excellent and very complicated question. So as technology has increased the amount of productivity that one person can do, it's made it so less people are needed to run any one farm. And it's a reality of technology, whereas when you look at the developing world, you have many, many, many people out laboring in the fields that, I don't know whether they want to be there or not, but as technology comes there, they will have that same decline. But in the US, to some extent, that line that's all the way down at 2% will probably continue to go down as more people can be productive. For example, as a combine can harvest more, you need less people in combines. And that's a challenge. That said, there is a huge number of jobs that are going unfilled in the agricultural world. So as far as who owns those farms or the consolidation of them, I would imagine that will continue to decline until it hits some homeostasis. But the number of people that are still involved in agriculture, it's something like 40% of agricultural jobs are not being filled right now, or the demand. So like if you're going to college and you want to be a part of agriculture, whether it's in breeding and biotech, or if it's in machinery, or if it's in farm management, there's a huge explosion of those. But with regards to how are we helping the farmers, we help them succeed as best they can to become profitable and solve problems. Unfortunately, as they become more efficient, some people will leave the farms and take other jobs.
Vance, real quickly, regarding resources, for those of us in here who are familiar with academic journals, are there any that you're aware of? Clearly, there are a lot of agricultural programs at universities across the country. Is there a certain journal that they may publish in, or series of journals that would be good, peer-reviewed sources for people to reference?
There is an excellent document that the AAAS put out. What is AAAS? The American Academies of Agricultural Sciences, and they've done 2 of them. Huge, giant meta-studies where they're producing how does genetic engineering impact crops. And I think that is probably a really good starting point, because it will then list out many, many, many journals, because they're doing a giant meta-study. And this is the highest academy in the land as far as agricultural sciences. So I would recommend starting there. I don't read specific journals. It's not my domain. But if you want, I can go ask people. I would say Dr. Folta is probably right now the world's preeminent person on talking with the people that are producing journals, and that's a great place to start.
Okay, any other questions?
FOLTA.
Okay, well with that, Vance, I'll just thank you for making time to be here and for coming, and remind everyone that there are those evaluation forms on your tables to pick up any continuing ed credits that you might need on the back table, and also to get a parking validation. And Vance will be here for a couple minutes, so if you do have a question that you want to ask him, please feel free to come up. But thanks so much.